Hi, Emma. I thought we'd start our reading with finishing up the Pinocchio story. So we're on chapter 32. Would you like to know what a surprise greeted Pinocchio that fine morning? I'll tell you. When he woke up, he scratched his head in a sleepy way. As he did this, he noticed to his amazement that his ears had grown at least 4 inches. You, my dear young readers, will be aware that ever since birth, Pinocchio's ears had been tiny. So tiny, in fact, as to be quite invisible to the naked eye. You should, therefore, have no difficulty imagining his shock at their overnight transformation into ears the size of canoe paddles. Here's a little sketch there. See Pinocchio? Pinocchio looked around for a mirror but couldn't find one. He filled the bathroom sink with water and leaned over it to examine his reflection. A horrible sight met his eyes. His face was decorated on either side with a magnificent pair of donkey ears. Pinocchio burst into tears. He began screaming and banging his head against the wall in desperation. But the more he cried, the more his ears grew. They even sprouted hairs at the top. A squirrel who lived on the floor above heard his piercing cries and went into his room to investigate. Seeing Pinocchio in such a state, she asked kindly, "What's wrong, my dear housemate?" "I'm ill, pretty squirrel," replied Pinocchio. "I've been struck down by a very frightening disease. Can you take my temperature?" "I'll try," she replied. The squirrel raised her right paw and felt Pinocchio's forehead. "I'm afraid it's bad news," she sighed. "What is it?" "You do have a fever." "What kind?" "Donkey fever." "I have no idea what you mean," said Pinocchio, who did. "Allow me to explain then," said the squirrel. "In 2 or 3 hours' time, you'll no longer be a puppet, still less a boy. What will I be? In 2 or 3 hours' time, you'll be a donkey. A proper little donkey, like the ones that pull carts of cabbages and lettuces at the market." "Oh, poor me!" Pinocchio cried. He grabbed hold of his ears, yanking at them so furiously you'd have thought they weren't part of him at all. "There's nothing that can be done about it now, dear boy," the squirrel said, by way of consolation. "It's just the way it is. Any child who turns his back on books, schools, and teachers and spends all day having fun will turn into a donkey sooner or later." "It can't be true," sobbed Pinocchio. "It's the gospel truth. Unfortunately, so there's no point in crying. But you should have thought about that earlier." "But it wasn't my fault," said Pinocchio. "It was Lampwick's." "Who is Lampwick?" "A friend of mine. I wanted to go home. I wanted to keep on studying and doing well in school, but Lampwick kept saying, 'Why do all this boring schoolwork? Why go to school at all? Come to Toyland with me. We'll live the high life and never study again.'" "And why did you take such bad advice?" the squirrel asked. "He doesn't sound like much of a friend." "Because I'm an extremely silly and heartless puppet. If I weren't, I'd never have abandoned the kind fairy who loved me like a mother. And by this time I wouldn't be a puppet any more. I'd be a nice, well-behaved boy, like any other. Just wait till I get my hands on Lampwick. I'm going to give him a piece of my mind." Here's a picture of Pinocchio. Pinocchio went to go outside. When he reached the front door, though, he remembered his donkey's ears and was too ashamed to leave the house. He went back in and found a large cotton cap, which he pulled down over his ears all the way down to his nose. Then he went out. He looked everywhere for Lampwick. He scoured the streets and visited all the puppet theaters, but without success. He asked everyone he met if they had seen him, but nobody had. Finally, he went to Lampwick's house. He knocked at the door. "Who is it?" Lampwick's voice answered. "It's me," called Pinocchio. "Wait a minute," Lampwick replied. Half an hour later, the door opened. Pinocchio was surprised to see his friend wearing a large cotton cap pulled up all the way down to his nose. The sight of that cap suddenly raised Pinocchio's spirits. Could Lampwick have donkey fever as well? The puppet pretended not to have noticed anything. "How are you, my dear Lampwick?" he smiled. "Never better," replied his friend, "like a cat in a dairy." "Are you sure? Why shouldn't I be? If you're so sure, why are you wearing that cap over your ears?" "Doctor's orders," Lampwick replied. "I've bumped my knee. And what about you, my dear puppet? Why are you wearing a hat almost down to your nose?" "Doctor's orders," said Pinocchio. "I grazed my foot." And here's an odd little illustration here. Poor Pinocchio, poor Lampwick. In the silence that followed, the two friends stared at each other, smirking. Pinocchio was the first to speak. "Lampwick," he said, "have you ever suffered from ear infections?" "Never," replied Lampwick. "And yourself?" "Never, although this morning one of my ears does seem to be giving me a bit of trouble." "Me too." "You too? And which ear is it?" "Both of them." "What about you?" "Both of them," said Pinocchio. "Could it be the same disease?" "Afraid it might be." "Would you do me a favor, Lampwick?" "Naturally." "Would you show me your ears?" "Of course. But first I want to see yours, my dear Pinocchio." No, you first." "Not likely. You first, then I'll show you mine." "Let's behave like friends," said the puppet. "Friends compromise." "What do you mean?" "Let's take our hats off at the same time. Agreed?" "Agreed." Pinocchio began to count. 1, 2, 3. On the count of 3, both boys pulled off their hats and threw them in the air. What happened next might seem incredible, but it's absolutely true. When Pinocchio and Lampwick realized they shared the same predicament, instead of feeling horrified and upset, they began to wiggle their ludicrous ears and make faces at each other, and then doubled up with laughter. Here's some pictures. They laughed and laughed till their sides ached. Then suddenly Lampwick fell quiet. His face turned gray. He began to stagger. "Help, Pinocchio," he called to his friend. "What's wrong?" "I can't stand up." "Neither can I," Pinocchio wailed, almost falling over. And as they spoke these words, they both fell to the floor and began to crawl around the room on their hands and knees. As they crawled, their hands turned into hoofs, their faces lengthened into muzzles, and their backs sprouted light gray fur speckled with black. But the moment of deepest humiliation for our two unfortunate friends came from when they felt their tails beginning to grow. Overcome with shame and sorrow, they opened their mouths to complain, but all they could produce were donkeys' brays. "Ee-aw! Ee-aw!" They were braying away in harmony when a knock came at the door. "Open up. I am the coachman who brought you here. Open up this minute, or else..." There's a little sketch there. That's the end of chapter 32. See you soon.